Hey guys, my name is Abongile and welcome to In Dialogue with Rabbi Bryan Opert, and he will be taking us through the history of Judaism and the textual interpretations of Genesis 1, 2 and 3. What are the historical origins of this religion?
I would argue that the historical origins really come from Genesis itself. Everything I'm going to say is going to be based, I'm going to try and keep it as much to the verses as possible, as opposed to any kind of extra commentary or further explanation.
Okay.
So in the verses themselves, when God creates the world, and what God does is he tries, so to speak, to create the spiritual world that he wants with Adam, with a single individual.
Okay.
He then moves on, that doesn't work, so he moves on to a family. So the next righteous person he's got is Noah, and that doesn't work either. So he then moves on to a nation, to an entire nation, and the nation appears at Mount Sinai. And that's really when the formal structure is given, where God says, the spiritual wisdom that I started the world with, I'm now going to formalize at the revelation at Sinai. So I think that the religion is based, the ideas of Judaism is based really in creation itself, but it's only formalized at the revelation of Sinai,
Okay.
when the structures of the laws are given.
So, what is the central sacred text of the religion?
There's two sacred texts, really. The one sacred text is the 5 books of Moses. That is the most sacred text, is the 5 books of Moses. In fact, it's one of the principles of faith of Maimonides, who's a philosopher from the Middle Ages, that in the 13 principles of faith, one of them is that Moses was the greatest prophet. And what that means is what he received becomes the central text. That becomes the central text. So that's the 5 books of Moses. Now, the second central text was an oral tradition. So to call an oral tradition a text is a bit difficult, is a bit complicated. Eventually it's written down in the Talmud, so that would be the written text.
Okay.
So if you would say that the two texts today that are studied in order to understand Judaism itself is the 5 books of Moses and the Talmud.
What language was this text originally written in?
Both of them written in Hebrew.
Oh, okay.
Both of them simply written in Hebrew. They were both given in Hebrew. The 5 books of Moses contains words from other languages. It contains Aramaic words, and it contains words that are not clear where they come from, but they're not Hebrew. So there are other words that are contained there. And the oral tradition was given in Hebrew and passed all the way down.
And who was it written by, and how were these texts selected and compiled?
The Orthodox position is based on Maimonides, who says that God dictated the 5 books of Moses and Moses wrote down.
Okay.
Right? That was it. Beginning and end of story. Reform go into a completely different direction, and they base themselves on the documentary hypothesis, fundamentally, which eventually develops, but by Julius Wellhausen. So they do not have the fact that it is a godly written piece of work, but rather is godly inspired.
How and by who are these texts interpreted and communicated with the broader Jewish community?
So they're communicated by people who are trained to communicate them. So what that means is as follows, is that there's a very, very specific line that goes from Moses all the way down more or less to the destruction of the first temple, which is more or less 586 before the Common Era, BCE. Okay. Then for 70 years there's an exile. Right? And it's considered that it carries on all the way through specific individuals who are the head of the religious courts and the head of the religious communities, the very, very heads. Right? Then you got the destruction. Eventually they go back to Israel. You got the destruction of the second temple. And then what happens is that there's the dispersion. And then in every community, the very, very greatest sages become the ones who pass it down. Now, the reason why I'm saying it like that is because basically until the destruction of the second temple, there was more or less one figure or one body of people that handed it down. After the destruction of the second temple, when you have the dispersion, then you start getting the different kind of interpretations, right? The different interpretations and the different nuances of the communities.
Is there a calendar or events specific to this tradition?
The chief rabbi of South Africa gave a very compelling argument to say the Sabbath. The Sabbath is certainly one that holds things together. And one of the aspects of the Sabbath, if we join it to the Sabbath, is the fact that it is something which takes place in the home with everyone together, and then it expands out to the community. So there's special prayers in the community, there's often special learning together in the community, and that reflects to a large extent that Judaism finds itself in a community.
What are the central rituals and practices of Judaism?
So the Sabbath has got some kind of central position, but fundamentally, Judaism is a ritual-based religion. So to say what ritual is more important than others, certainly the commentators explain that the laws between man and man are ones that need an enormous amount of focus.
Okay.
But to say that any of the specific ritual laws, right, about a kosher or tefillin, phylacteries, or wearing fringes on garments and stuff like that, it's very difficult to say which is more and which is not, which is less important. But fundamentally, the rituals, they create the structure of Judaism.
Are there any pertinent concepts or philosophies of the religion?
So the central pillars of the faith are that Maimonides places down, it says that this does not, because you've got an odd kind of reality about whether the Jewish people are a nation or a religion. So the Rambam's position is that once a person's born Jewish, they're 100% Jewish. But in order to build a spiritual relationship with God through Torah, one needs to have 13 principles that one believes in. What happens is you have other philosophers that come later and they reduce it. They reduce it to 6, and there's another philosopher that reduces it to 3. But what it really means is that God is in a dialogue with man. That they're in a dialogue where man does something, right, and God responds, and God is backwards and forwards with man. Now that is something that we'll come into understand when we do Genesis. But this concept of reward and punishment, that God's in a dialogue with man. The other principles of faith, for example, is the Messiah. Okay. Right? The other principle of faith is the fact that God exists, that there was nothing before or after God.
What is the creation story in Genesis 1?
The creation story, there are different commentators. There are different commentators on what the creation story is. The one that I find resonates the most is that the creation story is not about creation. The creation story is about the beginning of God building a relationship with man, and how that relationship is going to play itself out. So even within the verses themselves, there are many, many difficulties. There are many difficulties within the verses that seem to contradict each other and that don't explain everything. Can I give you an example?
Yes, please.
So an example is in the second verse. The second verse says, when the earth was astonishingly empty with darkness, and on the surface of the deep, the divine presence hovered upon the surface of the waters. Now, when it says the divine presence hovered upon the surface of the waters, what you never see is water being created. Water's never created. What you also don't see is ever created is air. So the fact that human beings are able to breathe air, which is made up of something, is never ever created. So there's certain elements of creation that are never included in the story. So there was some kind of either pre-creation, or this is not really the story of creation, but rather this is the story about how the world is slowly built in a way that climaxes at the creation of man on the 6th day, and then the spiritual reality of the Sabbath on the 7th day. In other words, it's much more of a preparation of a world in which man connects with God. That's what the creation story is.
Okay. Does it address what existed before creation?
Absolutely not.
No.
Absolutely not. What it says is that it was astonishingly void. It speaks about the language it speaks about is darkness, right? And as I said before, God says, "Let there be light," which is on the first day.
Yes.
Arguably, it's on the first day. It says there was water as well. So the thing is that we don't really understand, because all of those concepts are physical concepts. They're all concepts of our world. In other words, that the concept of darkness, for example, how would the concept of darkness exist in a world where there was no light? So even the language that's used before the first day is language that is still applicable to our world. Okay. So we don't know what went before. We don't know what went before. And the reason is we wouldn't have language to explain what went before our reality. The language we use is to describe our reality.
Genesis 1, verse 28 states that God blessed male and female. Is there reference to God blessing any other part of creation?
There's two other references. The one reference is God creating the Sabbath, blessing the Sabbath, which I understand would be slightly different, but that is something that God creates on the seventh day. And we can look at the verses to see how that is a creation on the seventh day. But God blesses the seventh day. Okay? The second creation, in actual fact, is given on the fifth day. On the fifth day, yes. On the fifth day, when God creates chochos, michis, and creeping crawlies. So in verse 22, so it's chapter 1, verse 22, God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the sea. But the fowl shall increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. So in the verse 22, God blesses them. So there are other blessings that are given.
Okay. Genesis chapter 1 verses 26 to 29 says this. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and they shall rule over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the heaven, and over the animals, and over the earth. What do you interpret this to indicate about the role of the human being in God's creation?
In the first chapter is more difficult. There's only one verse in the first chapter, and it says that God created man in his image. So that's chapter 1, verse 27. So that says that he created man in his image, which doesn't really flesh out much more about man. But certainly he's the only one created in the image of God, which is obviously a further discussion in and of itself, what it means in the image of God. Chapter 2, however, which also deals with the creation of man. And that's the story about him removing the side, right? Removing the side and creating even that whole story that people are familiar with. But before that, what it does is that it says that God creates man out of the dust of the earth, and then he blows into him a spirit of life. You do not see that duality in any of the other creations. There's two creations of man, really. And there was a Rav Soloveitchik, who was of the previous generation, who wrote, and he called the first one, Genesis 1, Adam 1, and Adam 2. Now, those two, I would suggest, need to be understood together. What Adam 1, in chapter 1, is speaking about, he's speaking about a man who is created in order to use the world to build a relationship with God.
Okay.
So he's above the world, right? He's above the world. And a lot of the language over here is he's created in the image of God. He's created like God. God is above nature. The other language that he has to subdue the earth, or there's different translations, but he's allowed to rule the earth, subdue the earth. So he is over here, Adam 1 is an Adam that is above nature, and he uses this world for. And then you can add in the various things. I would say that what the Torah's idea is, he uses the world to develop a community that serves God.
What differentiates the human being from other living things?
Now, the reason why, when we asked about is man different to all the other creations, one of the reasons I would say he is different is because it's further fleshed out in, he's the only creation that is repeated again in a following chapter. And the reason being is that he's such a complex individual. He's the climax of creation. He's the very pinnacle of creation. If one would see that really the story of the 6 days is really a story of evolution. And however non-religious that sounds, but it really is the story of evolution. It starts with, you've got water, you've got light, you got warmth eventually on the 4th day with the sun, and then you've got grasses, and you've got chochas, and you've got slowly they become more sophisticated beings. You've got man at the very top of that. One cannot explain this creation of man, and these 2 chapters are the central chapters to understand what man is about. And man is so sophisticated that it appears to be what the Torah does is that in order to keep the poetry, the style and the rhythm of the creation, in the first chapter, where it's broken up into the days, man is explained from one perspective, and the flow continues through the first chapter. But that's not enough. So it then comes back in the second chapter and further fleshes out this incredibly sophisticated being.
In Genesis 3, verse 22, the nature of the human being after the first sin is described. Could it be argued that the biblical text and commentary could be read to state that humankind became more like God after the sin?
The question that we would ask is, what is the story of the snake and Adam and Eve? On one level, it's a very superficial nursery school kind of story that the snake comes and says to Eve, eat of the tree, and she says, not really, come on, it's really nice, and then she does it. It's like as if she was on diet and there was the donut. Okay, all right, so that's not such an incredible story. That's not such an amazing story. On the other hand, the Torah places an enormous emphasis on this, because this is the first story where man becomes proactive, or man starts making choices by himself. Now, the evil comes from within us. I really, really want to go and do this. I really want a cheeseburger, which I do lust after, right? But I can't have milk and meat together. So that's it. It's not someone else saying, the cheeseburgers are delicious. It's me saying, I want to eat a cheeseburger. And then I need to battle with myself, as we all have those battles. Within yourself. That's the change that takes place at the sin. That gets on to what the fascinating verse is, when God says, behold, man has become like the unique one among us. The unique one, in this translation, right, is capital U and capital O, which really is speaking about God. So how does it happen that man seems to be elevated in some way, that he becomes like God? Right? That it seems to be, is this a reward, which it obviously can't be, because they went against the word of God, that they become like the unique one. But the aspect is, what happens now is that man is able to create his own destiny. He becomes a creator like God.
In your opinion, what is the tension of the human being as it is presented in Genesis 1, 2, and 3?
Within the phrases that are used with man, you constantly see the duality. When he's created, you got earth, you got dust of the ground, and you've got spirit. When he's then created into a further duality of male and female, he then understands the difference between good and evil. He's allowed to eat certain trees. He's not allowed to eat certain other trees. You've got this constant duality. None of this comes into any other kingdom. The animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, nothing else. There's no other duality that's created.
Do you have any suggestions about how we could approach studying this tradition from a religious studies perspective?
No. What I would say is that I have been fascinated why in English literature, when I was at school, we never learned the Bible as just a literature text, which would be interesting, because I think the impact it's had is no less than Shakespeare or Dickens or any of these other things that we've studied. But it seems to be that it's been left within the religious sphere. The fact that it brings in concepts of good and evil and the foundations of creation, I would say that from a religious perspective, we need to ask ourselves what that is.
Where and how is this tradition situated and functioning within the South African landscape?
One of the most outspoken proponents of Orthodox Judaism and Torah Judaism within the South African landscape might very well be the chief rabbi. There's a thing that he worked on with other religious leaders called the Bill of Responsibilities. So we all know the Bill of Rights. Yes. And people can get up and wave the Bill of Rights, and that's absolutely from the history of South Africa where it comes from. But what are the Bill of Responsibilities? Because your right and my right might very well not be in sync with each other. In other words, sometimes you've got rights that knock against each other, so what's our responsibilities? So what this speaks about, I would suggest to a very large extent, is that this book doesn't have any rights. Right? The Torah doesn't say you have a right to anything. It says this is what your responsibility to mankind is. Your responsibility is you may not steal, You are obligated, your responsibility is to honor your parents. Right? This is a book of responsibilities. And I think that speaks very, very much to our society.
Thank you to Rabbi Opert for taking the time to talk to us. And if you enjoyed this episode, you can find more information on the work done in the Religious Studies Department in the links below.